It is an immense pleasure, a real joy, to open this two-day symposium, Close, Distant, Embodied, Artificial Modes of Reading Today, here in this beautiful Jabal room. Before I begin, I want to extend my deep thanks to the Townsend Center for the Humanities for making this gathering possible, to Stephen and Rebecca for their generous and ongoing support, to Michaela for the tremendous work behind the scenes, and to Eric for designing the beautiful program you have in your hands. Thank you also to the departments of Comparative Literature, English, and German for co-sponsoring this event, and to our participants who have traveled from near and far for this shared effort of thinking together about reading modes today. But most importantly, thank you all for making the time to join us here today. Over the next 2 days, we will hear very different accounts of reading, and yet despite these differences, there seems to be at least one shared premise we bring into this room. That even though reading may appear in modernity as a solitary practice, even an escapist one, at its core, reading is profoundly collective, involving a dialogue with internalized others, with characters in the fictional world, with other previous and imagined readers, with social and political collectivities, and even with machines. And this symposium grew out of a true desire to make this collectivity visible and palpable, to open up space for conversation, for pushback, for shared thinking, for hesitation, for thinking aloud. So I invite you wholeheartedly to note your questions as you listen today so that you can pose them during the Q&A and hopefully open up an ongoing conversation. As I'm sure you've noted, I've already used the term reading several times as if we all know what we're talking about. But to quote Virginia Woolf, for though reading seems so simple, a mere matter of knowing the alphabet, it is indeed so difficult that it is doubtful whether anyone knows anything about it. Over the next 2 days, we will encounter not only divergent views of how we should or how we do in fact read, but also deeper disagreements on what reading even is to begin with. Is reading the deciphering of graphic signs on the page into semantic meaning? And if so, do machines perform this decoding as we do? Or is there already heterogeneity at this most elementary level? Is reading a metaphor for interpretation, for telling stories about stories? And if so, what counts as interpretation at all? And who decides which interpretations are valuable, persuasive, or legitimate? Perhaps reading is the lived experience of engagement with texts, the bodily and cognitive process involving joy, tears, distraction, desire, suspense that overcome us as we engage with the literary work. And do we confine this experience of reading to printed language, or does it extend across media and forms? From another an angle, reading perhaps is the act of articulating this encounter, the practice of writing down our thoughts, forming arguments, telling another what we have seen on the page. These questions carry enormous significance if we take reading to be the central craft we teach in departments of literature, perhaps even across the humanities more broadly. If this is indeed our main craft, then the future of the humanities is itself at stake in the question of reading, and this is no small matter. But this question is also crucial because teaching reading is the cultivation of cognitive and affective habits. If we are taught, for example, to suspect texts, as Sedgwick so famously detected, then that suspicion will not remain confined to literature. It will carry over into the narratives we engage with in the world around us, political or otherwise. And if we are trained to bracket emotions or bodily responses during the reading process, then this rigorous self-discipline and treatment of bodily communication will join us way beyond the college classroom. So when we learn how to read in a certain way, it becomes a habit of thought, a habit of being, an epistemology, what Michel Foucault called a technique of the self. And in a world whose crises require little elaboration, it matters deeply what kind of reader we imagine, and therefore what kind of reader, thinker, subject we help to form. So let us take the symposium not only to debate methods, but to also ask what reading makes of us, or what us does the act of reading make. Today we will have 3 panels. The first, which will shortly begin, will set definitional and conceptual pressures on what we mean by reading, by close reading, or by new critical close reading, hopefully giving the foundational terms of our conversation a good shake. The second panel, beginning at 2 p.m., will push against the disciplinary, geolinguistic, and historical limits that have shaped the current heated conversations around method. It will stretch the question of reading beyond the conventional frames of time and place that often structure our debates. And as someone who has written about close reading beyond the Anglophone orbit, I do realize how challenging pushing against these limits can be. In both of these panels, each talk will be 20 minutes long. We will try to be strict so that we have enough time for discussion. The final part of the day, centering on the seemingly contradictory pairing of sleep and reading, will take a less conventional form. Each participant will offer a brief 8-minute prompt, after which we will move into an open conversation between the participants and the audience, not only about questions of sleep and readerly mode, but also reflecting more broadly on the questions that we will have animated today. Tomorrow we will reconvene at 10 a.m. for an exciting panel that centers the reading body and the processes of typification that take place as we read. And we will conclude at 1 p.m. by zooming in on one of the most pressing questions of our moment, the presence of machines in our contemporary experience of reading, thinking through the perils and potentials of this presence. In order to dedicate as much time as possible to talks and discussion, we will keep speaker biographies brief, introducing participants by name and institutional affiliation only, but we all know that you know that these thinkers require very little introduction. Finally, I want to thank Matt Zebold, who, in addition to presenting his work tomorrow, will be recording this symposium for his marvelous, and I have to confess, addictive podcast, The American Vandal. So when the microphone comes your way, please speak clearly. Your voice may be headed for the airwaves. And now let me shift into my role as a moderator for our first panel, titled Close Reading at Issue, and introduce our speakers so we can get started. First will speak Jonathan Kramnik of the Department of English at Yale University. Then we will move to hear Toril Moy of the Literature Program at Duke University. And then we will move to Joshua Gang of the Department of English at the University of California, Berkeley. Jonathan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Yael, and thank you, Stephen and Michaela, and thank you all for coming. I'm really looking forward to the symposium this afternoon and tomorrow. It's a wonderful topic and urgent. So the topic of my paper today is what is close reading? No phrase carries more weight in the literary humanities than close reading. Asked what we do, we say that we read. Pressed further, that we read closely. The phrase names what distinguishes literary study as a discipline of knowledge and identifies its central method of inquiry. It signals not simply attention or appreciation, but a way of making claims about the world through sustained engagement with verbal form. This is not a nostalgic defense of the field. It clarifies, rather, what is currently at stake in literary study when we claim close reading as our method. At a moment marked by state-sponsored attacks on higher education, by austerity masquerading as innovation, and by various enthusiasms for artificial intelligence systems indifferent to meaning and lived experience, the question of what our discipline actually does has become newly pointed. I have argued for the relation between close reading and method at length in my recent book, Criticism and Truth, and I will return to parts of that argument today. Since the book's appearance, however, Close reading has become a topic of renewed and explicit attention across the profession. John Guillory's On Close Reading, Dan Sinekin and Joanna Wynet's anthology, Close Reading for the 21st Century, Yael's book, and my own, the reviews and exchanges around them, and even this conference suggest the same thing. Close reading is no longer simply practiced, it is again being talked about. As Wynet has neatly put it, close reading is having a moment. That's the only slides I'm going to have for my talk, actually, so I'll just leave the pictures of the 4 books up there for the remainder, kind of constellating the moment of close reading. For those of us who have been in the field for some time, this renewed attention is at least eyebrow-raising. Close reading never disappeared. What disappeared was our willingness to name and avow it. Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting the mic and this and my paper all aligned, but maybe that'll work better. Okay. So, all right. For a time, close reading was treated as obvious, insufficiently theoretical, apolitical, or even, and this is the most mysterious to me, irrelevant to method. It didn't appear much in the so-called method wars from the previous decade. Critics continued to practice it, often brilliantly, but some hesitated to acknowledge it as the ground of their authority. That hesitation has passed. Under prolonged financial, political, and institutional pressure, literary studies can no longer afford to speak lightly about what makes it distinctive. When asked what we do, we answer we practice close reading. That answer will not save us, but it at the very least is accurate. If close reading anchors the discipline's claim to knowledge, however, we ought to be able to say what it is. And that turns out to be harder than it sounds. The institutional and political conditions that make the practice newly visible are easy enough to describe. The practice itself is far more elusive. On this point, Guillory and I agree. At the core of literary study, he writes, is a practice with a history, but no precise verbal formula for its performance. Literary critics should therefore come to terms with the muteness of their core technique. That's him also. The question, however, is how to do so. How to coax close reading into speech without distorting it in the process. Here I part company with Guillory. For all its sociological acuity, On Close Reading remains curiously abstracted from the craft itself, treating close reading either as a special case of a general theory of reading or as an object of historical commentary. Talk about close reading. The book neither performs close reading nor analyzes it in detail. The result is a mismatch between subject and method, a book about close reading that does not itself read closely. It is hard not to feel in reading On Close Reading that the craft itself ought to be analyzed with the closeness it is supposed to perform. This recognition points in several important directions. For one, it suggests that there is no reason to expect a theory of close reading that would hold across all instances of the practice. That is not because the practice is ineffable or mysterious. Quite the contrary. It is because close reading is grounded, bound too tightly to its objects, too sticky, as I put it in Criticism and Truth, and therefore too various in its appearances to admit of general characterization. If Guillory's account remains largely aloof from the doing of close reading, and I realize I'm being a little more critical to John than I perhaps had meant to, but it's a wonderful book, but doesn't really get to its subject matter in a way that I think its subject matter actually requires. It's not close enough, as it were. If Guillory's account remains largely aloof from the doing of close reading, Sinekin and Wynet's, to their credit, moves in the opposite direction. After an initial effort to sketch what a theory of close reading might look like, they quickly turn instead to the practice itself. First in a collaborative reading of William Carlos Williams's The Red Wheelbarrow, and then to the readings they have assembled, letting the heterogeneity of the anthology form generate the terms of analysis. This strikes me as exactly right. We grasp what close reading is only by attending to instances, by watching what critics do when they do it well. Close reading is, in this sense, nothing other than its examples, a skill of making sentences answer to sentences that constrain and enable what they may do with them. Resistant to abstraction, it takes its shape from the object at hand, from what a given text will and will not allow a reader to do with it. Sinekin and Wynot's opening reading makes this point with elegant clarity. They focus on the word glazed, plucked from the poem and situated alongside red and chickens so that its distinguishing sophistication comes into view. In a stark and simple poem, glazed is the only word not stark and simple. Williams has selected the term, they want to argue, in order to mark the wheelbarrow as an aesthetic object, transforming rainwater into, quote, a glass-like sheen as on ceramics, end quote. The sheen on the instrument invites regard rather than use, a kind of purposiveness without a purpose, as it were, found among the ordinary equipment of the world. Or so they begin to show in an exemplary instance of mingling their words with Williams's. I've been interested in the small movements that compose this disciplinary practice, how critics place words from the works they are studying inside the sentences they are writing in order to gently alter both. In this case, the poem's clipped lines permit only so much pressure and so much distortion as they are handled. Glazed must be made to shine, but not too brightly. More importantly, so much depends upon the apt placement of just 4 words glued by a syntax opening the entire universe of aesthetic experience. Sinekin and Wynot turn Williams's resonant indicative to a question. How are we to understand that so much depends upon this wheelbarrow, they ask, preserving the intensified pronomial shape of the phrase while shifting its grammatical mood toward inquiry. Their early glimpse at a reading doesn't set up a general account of its practice so much as demonstrate how dexterity, constraint, and verbal tact together do their work at the level of the line and sentence. That work will vary according to the nature of the inquiry and is object dependent, as the contents of the anthology amply demonstrate. Leafing further ahead in the anthology, for example, notice the way that Lindsay Rexon notices Kevin Quashie's art of noticing the, quote, dancing waltz of anaphora, that's Quashie, in the poetry of Lucille Clifton. There, the quotation, he do, she do, they live, they love, they try, they tire, they flee, they fight, they bleed, they break, they moan, they mourn, they weep, they die, they do, they do, they do, isn't so much embedded as set apart and then adroitly mimicked. Quashie waltzes to Clifton's beat, that's Rexon, in order to join the poets building a world where, and this is Quashie, quote, blackness exists in the tussle of being, in reverie and terribleness, in exception and in ordinariness, end quote. Rexon joins the dance too, and this is what I want to notice especially, does so by echoing Quashie's echo of Clifton's style. And this is Rexon. The radiant multiplicity of black aliveness as it flees, fights, bleeds, breaks, is right there in the repetition, in the gorgeous play of sonic sameness and difference, end quote. Rexon's artful and alliterative asyndeton, flees, fights, bleeds, breaks, moves with Quashie, moving with Rexon. So the aliveness in question is, in her words, right there. To describe the act of quoting and echoing, of picking and placing, to note how glazed is set in relation to so much depends, how anaphora and a syndeton dance in the critic's sentence, is already to recognize something essential about close reading. It is to recognize, first of all, that close reading is a compositional practice. This is a point I press on in Criticism and Truth, and one that has met with some resistance. That resistance is understandable. We are accustomed to thinking that close reading names a heightened form of reading, more attention, more care, more thoughtfulness applied to the page. But close reading is not reading in that sense at all. Close reading is not passive absorption or the silent decoding of graphic marks. It is not an interior state. It is rather an activity whose evidence lies in what gets made. It's not really reading. This is a point that I make in the book that, again, generated a fair bit of resistance. If that sounds counterintuitive, it is only because we mistake the preliminary act of reading for the critical act that follows. As we have just seen, what distinguishes close reading is not intensity of perception, but the craft of compositing and quoting and arranging, of building new sentences that incorporate and transform sentences already given. In the classroom, this craft takes the form of speech. On the page, where scholarly criticism happens, it takes the form of writing. Sinekin and Wynett seem to acknowledge this fact without exactly stating it. They begin with the familiar scene of absorptive reading. You start with someone else's words, you see something in the words that means something to you, you pause, you reread, end quote, but then quickly acknowledge that the practice at issue is something else. Remember, they write, we are talking about how to organize a close reading in an essay, an article, or a chapter, not what the activity of reading itself is like, end quote. Close reading as criticism, I have been wanting to point out, consists in compositional acts, quotation, embedding, extension, summary, and a kind of controlled mimicry akin to free and direct discourse, as we saw in the Quashie and Rexon example. The critic's sentences must accommodate themselves to sentences already shaped. Writing with the words of the world is skilled, risky work, governed by norms internal to the activity itself. It is precisely because those norms can be met or missed that close reading functions as a method and as a form of knowledge. Where there are norms internal to a practice, where sentences can answer well or poorly to other sentences, there is already the space for truth. I focused on quotation in Criticism and Truth to show that close reading is a form of making under constraint, a skilled and creative practice of writing with another's words, not merely about them. Unlike other disciplines that study works of art, we compose in the same medium as our object, making actual contact with and incorporating pieces of the works we study. This practice is a vital part of the larger suite of actions that authorize the truth claims distinctive to criticism and so function as a method proper to the field. Much can be said about aesthetics and class in Williams's Poetry and Moment, as Sinekin and Wynett suggest, or about Black world-making in Clifton's, as Rexon and Quashie suggest. But any such argument must begin from and be scaffolded on the apt fitting of their sentences to his or hers, a fit answerable to the judgment of peers. This argument, too, encountered some resistance. In her generous and thoughtful review, for example, Torrell was especially resistant to this account, objecting that an emphasis on elegance or aptness of fit risks importing a positivist picture of knowledge by another name, treating close reading as a kind of measurement where correctness is secured by formal correspondence rather than by meaning. I take this worry seriously, but it rests, I think, on a misidentification of what elegance does in critical practice. Elegance is not a metric or a proxy for objectivity. It names a judgment internal to a skilled activity, registering how well a critical sentence takes up, bears, and extends the sense, structure, and feeling of the world it engages. The fit at issue is not between proposition and world, as it might have been under positivism, but between acts of saying, between the critic's sentences and the literary ones they answer to and create with. Such judgments are neither algorithmic nor indifferent to experience. They depend on trained skill, responsiveness, and risk, and remain answerable to shared standards of practice rather than external criteria of measurement. The alternative is one no one would want to entertain, especially under current conditions, that Sinekin and Wynett, Rexon and Quashie, or everyone in this room isn't telling the truth when they do their readings well. What this implies, though I will only sketch it here, is that meaning in criticism is not extracted from texts and then checked for accuracy, but made in practices of writing that answer to and participate in our experience of reading and other embodied actions. I'm grateful to Toril for pressing me on the criteria of meaning and experience, and I will return to them in a moment in a concluding thought on the AI context that was not fully present when composing Criticism and Truth. But first, I want to linger briefly on the language of evaluation itself. The specter of positivism, along with the skeptical residue of post-structuralism, has limited our willingness to claim epistemic force for close reading. Toril writes that we praise readings as, quote, powerful, original, path-breaking, imaginative, etc. I agree, and I would add elegant, dexterous, apt, adroit, and other aesthetically charged terms. My point is simply that these are not alternatives to epistemic judgment, but its expression, ways of marking that the work of understanding has been done well. Scientists, too, rely on such evaluative language despite methodological differences. To abandon this claim would not be theoretical sophistication, but acquiescence to the idea that only certain forms of inquiry count as knowledge at all. A disaster, if ever there were one. On the matter of acquiescence and disaster, please forgive me for a polemical conclusion, and for me at least, an unusually hectoring one. When I was writing Criticism and Truth only a few years ago, the power of large language models to imitate some of the surface features of close reading was only just becoming visible. Now we write amid the din of artificial intelligence propaganda and messianism, with their industry-backed, austerity-driven corrosion of the university all around us. I am often asked whether AI can do close reading. My answer, as Turing once said about whether machines can think, is that the question is too meaningless to deserve discussion. The question is meaningless, not because we should look more closely at how machines imitate the surface features of close reading, that might have been Turing's answer, but because reading and writing are not merely syntactic operations. They are activities of embodied creatures whose words entwine with experience. There is something important in that simple observation. If AI has done anything of value, it is to force us to confront questions of life, experience, and meaning that many of us had taken too easily for granted. AI has none of these things and never will. Only embodied living creatures are conscious and possess experience. Only embodied living creatures practice close reading and participate in the common and contested meanings such readings create. This is not a speculative hypothesis so much as a commitment, philosophical and ethical alike, that I am prepared to stand by. There are too many suffering animals in the world for us to wonder seriously whether machines are sentient. In this way, the hegemony of artificial intelligence illuminates close reading by negation. Sentences produced by a machine that does not experience the world allow us to see more clearly how experience crisscrosses and suffuses all acts of meaning, all acts of encountering, altering, and creating sentences that come from and help compose a world whose fragility we understand all too well. Once again, close reading will not save us, but it might point us toward what is worth saving. Practices of meaning making carried out by living beings in common. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I want to say that I think okay, and you don't get to time this 1 minute intro. First of all, I'm someone who learned when I was a beginning student of literature, I learned close reading in Norway under the influence alongside French and German theorists. And that's a context you don't even hear of in this country, but I'm not going to talk about that. So I want to say thank you so much for inviting me, Yael, Stephen, Michaela, for doing all this work. My talk, I really think I wrote 100 pages. That's not going to fly with 20 minutes. So I've got a lot of slides. Some I will just leave for you to ponder. And I've tried to cut as much as I possibly can. So my talk is called Finding the Right Place for Close Reading. Attention, formalism, and the defense of literary studies was one version. Now it's concept, attention, and the limits of formalism, but it's the same thing. Some years back, literary critics engaged in the so-called method wars, triggered by Stephen Best's and Sharon Marcus's now classic essay, Surface Reading, and continued in the very many vehement responses to Rita Felsky's The Limit of Critique. But the method wars have died down. It's no longer critique that's said to constitute the essence of our craft. It's close reading. I have all those books that Jonathan showed at home, and a couple more too. So something's going on. Now, this paper has two main parts. I show that Wittgenstein's investigation of reading challenged two beliefs quite common in many discussions of close reading today. First, the belief that we actually need to have a clearly defined concept or theory of reading, or for that matter of terms such as literature and literary studies, let alone that horrible thing, literariness. But I will only talk about reading. And secondly, Wittgenstein helps us to challenge the idea that it makes sense to think about close reading as a particular mental state or process, for example, attention. So here my views overlap a lot with Jonathan's, and in some bits, in the last bit, they don't overlap at all. Because in the last part, my second part, I'll show what's wrong with the idea that to defend close reading is to defend literary studies, or turn that upside down and say, why should we define literary studies as somehow, why is close reading the essence of everything we do? That's why my talk is called Finding the Right Place for Close Reading. I mean, so obviously it's not about being for or against it, it's where it belongs, as it were. So attention to particulars, Wittgenstein on reading. In philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein discusses reading at some length. This is part of his efforts to get clear on how we can tell that someone else knows something, has learned to do something, has mastered a skill. In general, his answer is that at some point they know how to go on their own. You'll say, now I get it. I know how to do it now. If someone declares joyfully, now I can go on, how can I tell that they are right? If I declare that I have learned fluent French, well, how would you know? At stake then is what we have to go on when we say things like, oh, my students still don't get what a close reading is, or when we declare proudly, my daughter has learned how to read. Reading is an interesting case to investigate, Wittgenstein notes, because in the circumstances of our ordinary life, the use of the word is extremely familiar to us. I mean, he and Virginia Woolf live in England at the same time, have the same view on reading. In one way, then, reading is a perfectly ordinary, utterly unproblematic word or concept. At the same time, it's really difficult to get clear on. Wittgenstein also says, but the part the word plays in our life, and so too the language game in which we employ it, would be difficult to describe, even in rough outline. Reading escapes our efforts to pin it down under a concept, particularly under a rigidly bounded concept, which is Wittgensteinian for theory, definition, or so on. Wittgenstein begins by distinguishing between reading and understanding. In fact, the section on reading follows the section on understanding. At stake is simply, for him here, the activity of knowing how to read. Reading here is the activity of rendering out loud what is written and printed, but also writing from dictation, copying something printed, playing from sheet music, and so on. Now, the distinction between reading and understanding is actually quite crucial, and it sometimes disappears from discussions of close reading, where they seem to just float into one another. But I know how to read. But of course, that doesn't guarantee that I understand the text I'm reading, even if I publish my close reading of it. So Wittgenstein refuses to draw up concepts, a theory. Here's just a bit of the very important paragraph 71, which I discuss at length in my Revolution of the Ordinary. I'm only commenting on the thing I put in blue here. So Wittgenstein refuses to draw up a concept, a theory with sharp boundaries. Instead, he describes a number of examples of activities we call reading. He doesn't claim that in spite of their differences, they nevertheless all have something in common. Giving examples is not an indirect way of explaining in default of a better one. I mean, we are tempted to think that if we can lay down a theory, a general definition, then we have understood all the cases. But even those definitions, in fact, build on the cases and are only as good as your examples, essentially. His refusal to accept that concepts with sharp boundaries are always better at capturing human knowledge than a series of examples is characteristic of Wittgenstein's late philosophy. And it is its most salient difference from all other major forms of mainstream theory and philosophy, continental, post-structuralist, analytic, which still dominate literary studies. Now, my point here is not that everyone must be Wittgensteinian. I mean, that would be lovely, but that's not my argument. I wish that more people would engage with his insights, argue with them if they like. But right now we have a situation where no one, people write about reading, but they haven't looked at Wittgenstein on reading, which I find problematic. That's why I go over this here. Now, what happens then is that people forge ahead doing exactly what Wittgenstein warns us against without any seeming awareness that intellectual alternatives exist. And therefore, they also give no reasons why the way they go about things is better. Now, here I was going to go into John Guillory's very interesting belief that he needs to lay down a very general theory of reading before he can even get to close reading. And of course, with my 20 minutes and so on, you won't hear that. But there's a lot of very strange things in this definition of reading, which I persist in thinking we don't need. But the most interesting is the idea that writing is an instrument for reading. Think about that. What would it mean to say that a script alphabet, my words, is an instrument for my reading? Like a hammer to a nail? Or would that be like a nail to a hammer? I would say the relationship is grammatical in Wittgenstein's sense. I'll get to that. You can't talk about writing or reading without talk about the one, you talk about the other. They're not divisible into a kind of instrumentality in that way. But be that as it may, when Guillory goes on to actually define close reading, you will notice that he doesn't use any of that long definition. Suddenly it's showing the work of reading. And that's actually fine with me. I like the latter effort better than the former. But he, in fact, points out that close reading isn't really reading at all, but a form of expression. It can be exhibited and so on. Now, this is a point that I, Anne Guillory, and my colleague Jonathan Kramnik absolutely agree on. It's obviously, you can't tell if you're dealing with a close reading if there is no expression of anything. But then there is a contradiction in Guillory then. He believes that he has to define reading, but suddenly close reading has to be an exhibition, which would make it writing or speaking or something. You get the idea. So Wittgenstein proposes an alternative. He begins by conducting a grammatical investigation. We could say that where traditional philosophy talks about ontology, for some analytic philosophers is more metaphysics, then Wittgenstein will talk about grammar. Grammar is the rules, as it were, or the criteria for why we say what we say. Grammar tells what kind of object anything is. Now, what's important here then is this is an argument against a general theory of reading as such, whether it's Guillory or something entirely different. It's saying rather that remember that there's a continuous series of transitional cases to look at. What, for example, how can I tell whether someone is reading as opposed to reciting from memory? You think your child has learned to read, but no, you've read the storybook so often they know it by heart, but they still can't read. Instead of laying down a concept with rigid boundaries, a grammatical investigation maps a network of examples. And when we investigate them, we will find that we use the word read for a family of cases. And in different circumstances, we apply different criteria for a person reading. And then that means you should ask, what are your criteria for recognizing that someone's reading? For close reading, for that matter, criteria are revealed in use. So this is why Wittgenstein's slogan is attention to particulars. If you want to know what something means, you've got to look at the specific cases. However, that's the argument against general theories and definition. Now I'll very briefly explain why Wittgenstein has a very good argument against trying to define reading as a specific experience. And that includes a specific mode of attention, anything that goes on inside you that is taken to accompany this outer activity. Now, we often feel that some activity is accompanied by some inner process, for example, attention. Wittgenstein is, of course, not saying that that isn't a feeling we have or that we're wrong to think that. But he does remind us that an inner process stands in need of outward criteria, which means if we somehow never betray it with any expression, how would you know? And you couldn't say, oh, well, I'll put them in an MRI machine, because you don't know what you're looking for, because what word would you use to test? What are you testing, as it were? So there are inner processes, but if the inner processes remain inner and hidden, we have no criteria for claiming that it's always present, let alone for turning it into a fundamental part of the activity. And this has consequences for close reading. So I'm going to have to go very quickly over this because I want to get to my last part. But in Wittgenstein, I'm giving you the slides here. The interlocutors insist of course, reading is a particular process. Read a page of print, the interlocutor says, and you can see there's something special. So reading is a particular experience. That's the voice of the hidden. They want to anchor our understanding of our activities in some inner hidden feeling or so. You can see this in close reading discussions, where sometimes you hear, well, it's a sort of very focused reading, as if if close reading is mostly what you write, how you get to it is very varied. We will get to that. So anyway, Wittgenstein, where are we? Wittgenstein then argues with his interlocutor, I'll skip that, but the interlocutor then goes but you must be a behaviorist, Ludwig, you can't go on like this. And then in despair, he says, you will surely admit that there's a difference between pain behavior with pain and pain behavior without pain. And Wittgenstein, admitted? What greater difference could there be? Meaning, of course, there are so many differences. Like in one case, you're maybe a malingerer or a hypocrite. In the other, you should be rushed to hospital, and so on and so on. So note that Wittgenstein is fully with us on the idea that we have experiences, sensations, and feelings as we read, but they don't secure the meaning of the word read, so that every time you say read, you can assume attention, feeling, or something. That you could, sometimes we have them, sometimes we don't, but that's not how you can tell if I'm reading. I will just remind you that if you wanted to figure out, say we have some perfect brain scanning machine that can tell where the neurons are firing, you would still have to do the conceptual work of figuring out what you're looking for. And I have some terms here, like how would you know if your machine tested close reading, ordinary reading, immersive reading, speculation, thinking, focusing, free associating, all those things that go on in our heads as we read. They're not controllable by definition. I mean, let's not go there if we want to understand reading, as it were. You can obviously interview people about their feelings in reading, and then you'll be doing some kind of anthropology or psychology, and that could be fascinating. But that's not the conceptual work that Wittgenstein's after. So obviously, one of the reasons, where am I here? One of the reasons that the debates about close reading in literary theory have become a bit, should we say, confused is that we sometimes think of reading as a skill or an activity, Wittgenstein's sense of knowing how to read, and sometimes as interpretation, exegesis, analysis, understanding, and so on. And clearly, they're not the same. And then if you then fuse into that a set of feelings and inner feelings, attention, and so on, that we're also supposed to have, you have, in my mind, lost so much clarity that you'll never be able to come up with an interesting analysis. I mean, but, you know, this is like a warning for how to go about thinking about reading, I suppose. But now I'm coming to the bit where I disagree with Jonathan, but I'm not discussing his book particularly. It's not about that. But it is the idea that close reading is the foundation of literary studies. It's the incarnation of what we do, that what we do is I read closely and so on. I don't think that's true. Now, if we... slow, focused reading is one thing we can do. Underline, try to pay attention to every detail and so on. And I'm talking about reading as an activity. I certainly think it's obvious that we don't all write books that are just close reading. We do so many other things in our books, so I assume I don't have to argue for that. When I teach Simone de Beauvoir to graduate students, I urge them to practice the art of beach reading. I tell them not to underline or annotate much, just to find a way to get through the very long text. How long have I got to go? Like I haven't got any. In which case, you'll have to forgive me. I need 5 minutes, but I can do it in 5. So that the point here is there are many ways of getting to grips with the text, and some of them are totally necessary if you want, say, to teach or work on very long texts, for example. The second point here is that when you settle down to write and think, you do it with interruptions. You notice something, it tugs at you, you want to write about it, and so on. There is no such thing as the fact that you sit there and do that close reading, sentence by sentence, like for what, weeks, without ever interrupt. I mean, reading is coming and going, back and forth, and so on. Now, close reading is really good for a number of things, but I think close reading alone is certainly never enough for any of the things I want to know in literature. I find that I can't make sense of details in, say, a play by Ibsen if I don't know a lot about the literature of his time, literary history, philosophy, Ibsen's biography. I may have to be able to look up things in a dictionary, and then to close read sometimes gets presented as paying attention to the words on the page. But words mean as utterances in context, and if you don't understand them, you won't understand the words on the page. And of course, to find the right place for close reading is important. The challenge is not to be melodramatically for or against it. It's to find the right place for it in the vast family of activities that comprise literary studies. Wittgenstein says, essentially, find the right circumstances where close reading can shine, for there it does make sense. So close reading is great if you actually want to know what figures and tropes one particular writer uses in one particular short text. But then you also will have to explain why that is an important question. What's at stake when you do that? It's not good enough to say, oh, this is what we know how to do. It's our strategy, our technique. It's a fantastic strategy and technique, but it can't answer all questions in the world. And it certainly can't answer all questions we want to ask literature. So to put it this way, your method will depend on what you want to know. And to find out what you want to know, you have to work very hard sometimes. Close reading is one instrument, but it is not the only one. So I will just end. So what I'm skipping here is reminding you that close reading has been a dominant paradigm since the new critics and British critics in the 20s and 30s were yearning to find a way to respond to modernism, which traditional critics couldn't read because they didn't understand the techniques, the metaphors, and so on. And it was valuable and it was good, and it became a dominant paradigm. But paradigms aren't meant to last forever, and it can't be our only one or the dominant one today. So that I am going to end by just saying that close reading is usually championed by people who think that underlying all our work in literary studies is a concern with literature as form. Formalism really excludes too much about what's valuable in literature. And I'm going to read my last page now, and I will want to say that I don't know fully what formalism is. I certainly am not trying to lay down a definition, but I'm maybe talking about it here as the effort to think that form is like the key thing that all literary critics must know about, for example. So what does formalism exclude? It makes little space for empirical work, whether it's in literary history, literary biography, or the sociology of literature. Although their formal entities, plot and character, usually are of very peripheral interest to the champions of close reading. In her influential book, Forms, Caroline Levine agrees that traditionally content and context have been excluded. And for me, this is a huge problem. After all, we can't just skip the content and contents, which the forms are bound up with. So the ones are in, you can't pry the one loose from the other. So that when Levine goes as far as to define form as arrangements of elements and ordering, patterning, or shaping, you get a perfectly empty definition of form, as if it existed, I don't know, in a space apart from anything in particular. All this I could go on about, but I will just say formalism can easily make us forget that literature is also has, of course, literature is art and form, but it has also been an attempt to say something about something. There is aboutness in literature. So writers have wanted to say something about good and evil, honor and shame, sex, love, adultery, divorce, war and peace, power and exploitation, history and time, and a myriad of other things, anything that human existence has been into for good and for bad. And all those things cannot be boiled down to what close reading can capture. So of course, I agree that literature is also form. As all literary critics, I also get very annoyed every time I run into a philosopher who uses a literary work just as a prop to support their thesis. I say, you're overlooking the point of view. Didn't you notice that metaphor? And so on. But let me end then. Literature is art and form, but art and form that gives us an unparalleled record of human existence, human society and culture going back thousands of years. Literature is the best archive of human existence we have. Of course, it's worth studying from a number of perspectives. To defend our field, we should defend our object, but all the things that we would lose out on if no one ever studied old literature, ancient literature, literature from countries other than the Anglo-Saxon sphere, to put it that way. Think about this. how can we defend our field by defending one narrow method when we could defend its subject matter? So, final line, there is a place for close reading, but because they have over-promoted and overvalued close reading as a foundational skill, the defenders of close reading have not done much to establish what exactly its place should be. The best way to defend literary studies in a world hostile to the humanities is not to focus myopically on close reading. It is to defend literature as worth reading, worth knowing, worth caring about, both as it has been over the millennia and it is as it is today. And it is to do the work to show what the world would lose if we lost all knowledge of that archive of human existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Yael, Stephen, Michaela, everyone for this opportunity. Really thrilled to have a chance. I want to respond to these two papers. Unfortunately, I also have to say this. So, which, nothing to bring up the mood like talking about William Wimsatt in detail. So on the final page of the verbal icon, Studies in the Meaning of Poetry, in the essay Poetry and Christian Thinking, Wimsatt throws us a curveball. What he asks is an adequately serious view of poetry. I submit that this has always been and remains difficult, if not impossible, to define with any rigor. I'm still reading Wimsatt, by the way. What is the formula by which we shall recognize the metaphoric capacities of language and the moral importance of valid linguistic expression without surrendering our conception of truth as a thing beyond language? I confess I do not clearly see the answer, but I insist that this question is a real and important one, and not only for more dogmatic Christians and less dogmatic Christians, but for all persons who are interested to inquire into the norms by which we live. Like Wimsatt, I would also love to know the magic formula for balancing the metaphoric capacities of language and the moral importance of valid linguistic expression without surrendering our conception of truth as a thing beyond language. Who wouldn't love to know that formula? But depending on how you remember the critics, you might be surprised that Wimsatt wanted that formula at all. Generally speaking, we don't equate new critical formalism with a conception of truth as a thing beyond language. Instead, whatever else we might take away from Wimsatt and Beardsley's various fallacies, the version of new critical formalism that has proven the most tenacious, that we still lug around for better and for worse, is Cleanth Brooks's well-wrought urn. Instead of truth originating outside language, Brooks's urn is a closed system that imagines itself generating meaning and then protecting that meaning from time and the external world. But the linguistic and/or extra-linguistic origin of truth is not the only thing that Brooks and Wimsatt disagree upon. In contrast to Wimsatt's moral and theological investments, Brooks says critics should avoid talking about morality. Any human act, he writes, is of course a moral act, and any act of judgment, including that of aesthetic judgment, has a moral aspect. But Brooks also warns that moral value has a tendency to overtake critical value. Someone like Ivor Winters, he says, quote, expands morality too much by making it include all value judgments. Poetry tends to become the handmaid of religion or philosophy, whether Christian, Marxist, or some other. Brooks's solution, which I think is very much indebted to the seal of the urn, is to say that we can and ought to avoid talking about morals entirely as critics. In other words, to preserve the metaphysical and disciplinary significance of aesthetic judgment, Brooks is willing to sacrifice its moral counterpart, at least in this context. Wimsatt, of course, isn't willing to do this, nor surrender his conception of truth as a thing beyond language. As a self-avowed Christian critic, we infer he insists on either the metaphysical or practical necessity of both lowercase and capital T truth originating outside language, and ergo outside the acts of reading and writing. And yet when we talk about Wimsatt's most famous contributions to literary study, the aforementioned intentional and affective fallacies, which he co-wrote with Monroe Beardsley, these sorts of considerations don't enter into it. Lots has been said about the political implications of new criticism, which is usually related to the kinds of writers, readers, and historical information that the new critics included or excluded. But except for those who are still thinking about Ivor Winters, myself included, we don't talk about the moral implications of new criticism and critical practice. The moral concepts involved when we separate affective responses from linguistic meaning, or what sorts of things we must value or not value morally if we want to infer an author's intent. In short, we don't consider how analyzing the text and analyzing only the text might be a morally significant act, even though for Wimsatt, that's exactly what it was. So that's what I'm going to try today. While the affective fallacy and Wimsatt's textualism were certainly directed at solving certain kinds of critical problems, I think the real problems Wimsatt had in mind were meta-ethical ones. Inasmuch as it constrains the types of goodness that can be attributed to poems, the affective fallacy constitutes a practical solution to the questions about the emergence of moral properties that Wimsatt posed in some of the verbal icon's less infamous essays, including Poetry and Christian Thinking, Poetry and Morals, and Concrete Universals, none of which were co-authored with Beardsley. In so doing, the affective fallacy creates a critical and meta-ethical framework where poetic value has almost nothing to do with poetry at all. But there is a problem with my plan. Nowhere in the affective fallacy do Wimsatt and Beardsley talk about morality. Instead, as we all know, the focus is on meaning and method, whereby the affective fallacy amounts to a critical, quote, confusion between the poem and its results, what it is and what it does, a special case of epistemological skepticism. Like the intentional fallacy, the outcome of the affective fallacy is that, quote, is the poem itself as an object of specifically critical judgment tends to disappear. In the wake of I.A. Richards' Meaning of Meaning, Practical Criticism, Science and Poetry, etc., the apparent disappearance of the poetic object was a preoccupation of Wimsatt's. In the affective fallacy, this disappearance was attributed to Richards' separation of emotive from referential meaning. Wimsatt and Beardsley write, the types of meaning which were defined in Practical Criticism and Meaning of Meaning were created partly by suggestion, partly with the aid of direct statement, a clean antithesis between symbolic and emotive use of language. What's odd about the affective fallacy, however, is that most of the attacks on Richards happen indirectly. Wimsatt and Beardsley launched their attacks on Richards and his emotive semantics only through the proxy of the philosopher Charles Leslie Stevenson. They justify this by saying it's Stevenson who offers the most responsible version of emotive meaning. They write, C.L. Stevenson has given an account which, as it is more careful and explicit than the others, may be taken as most clearly pleading the emotivist cause and best revealing its weakness. For Wimsatt and Beardsley, the trouble with Stevenson, and Richards presumably, was that this separation between emotive and semantic meaning makes it easier for readers to confuse their emotions for semantic comprehension. For in separating emotive meaning for semantic meaning, what Stevenson had done was weaken the distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive events. The only way to talk about emotive meaning, they said, that is, to talk about emotions having linguistic properties and following linguistic rules, was to treat emotive responses and emotive expressions as if they were the same kind of thing. As Wimsatt and Beardsley write, the term emotive meaning as used by Stevenson and the more cautious term feeling as used by Richards do not refer to any such cognitive meaning as that conveyed by the name of an emotion. Rather, these key terms refer to the expression of emotive state, and hence also to the emotive response, which these words may evoke in the hearer. The problem is that emotions and language don't work the same way. On that, Wimsatt and Beardsley and I agree. While cognitive or descriptive meanings can be stabilized by a definition we infer, emotive meanings are subjective and can't be defined systematically. And while it makes sense to distinguish between what a word means semantically and what it suggests, whether personally or conventionally, that distinction doesn't apply to emotive meanings because they necessarily result from suggestion. But as we conceive of those emotions as meanings, we now have a kind of subjective emotional response that we perceive as potentially indistinguishable from objective linguistic meaning. And that, we infer, is how the affective fallacy makes a poem disappear. So again, where's the morality? Well, as I said, it's missing almost entirely, except that the title of the book by Stevenson that Wimsatt and Beardsley quote is called Ethics and Language. Again, it is odd that Wimsatt and Beardsley make Stevenson Richard's proxy, especially considering how much they enjoy attacking Richards directly in other writings. But it's even stranger that they say the best version of a mode of meaning comes not from a familiar critic, but an unfamiliar philosopher, whose meta-ethical arguments and rationale for needing a mode of meaning are left out entirely. But when you read Ethics and Language, you see how relevant his argument and rationale actually are. So unless we want to say Stevenson's main ideas were left out unintentionally, and I think that would be a mistake, we must instead proceed from the possibility that this exclusion was intentional, the other fallacy be damned. And if it was intentional, new questions emerge. What about Stevenson's arguments might have been a problem for literary study or poetry thus conceived? What about Stevenson's arguments couldn't Wimsatt and Beardsley or the concept of the affective fallacy abide by? In essence, why can't Stevenson's real arguments enter into this essay? The goal of Ethics and Language was to establish what separates instances of moral language from non-moral language. What theory of language, Stevenson asked, could account for the ways we use moral language and the power that we perceive in those utterances? Modern moral philosophy, he claimed, had misconstrued what was at stake in moral propositions. In the sciences, he said, agreement and disagreement are cognitive matters of propositional belief. In such cases, he writes, one person believes that P is the answer and another that not P, or some proposition incompatible with P is the answer. In contrast, ethical agreements and disagreements are non-cognitive disjunctions between approval and disapproval, that is, differences in attitude or emotion. When two people disagree about a moral problem or any problem of value, really, the problem isn't that they don't agree on the facts. Instead, Stevenson said, it's that one of them approves of an action and the other doesn't. This is why Stevenson's work in moral philosophy, along with A.J. Ayer, is typically labeled emotivism and is also sometimes lumped in with 18th century sentimentalism. That is, Stevenson and Ayer argued that moral concepts and statements were fundamentally expressions of emotion. When I say something is good, Stevenson said, I'm not making a point about something cognitive. Instead, I'm making a point about my attitude of approval or gratification. So if I, not Stevenson, say that Frank O'Hara's Lana Turner Has Collapsed is a good poem, I'm not saying it has some property coextensive with goodness. Instead, I'm saying I like the poem. But this was only half of Stevenson's claim. In the same way that moral statements are not cognitive statements, the nature of moral language isn't solely descriptive or expressive. Instead, moral propositions are imperative and exhortative. They are aimed at influence or even coercion. Ethical sentences, he wrote, are used more for encouraging, altering, and redirecting people's aims and conduct than for simply describing them. To illustrate this, as well as the non-cognitive meaning of good, he translated different ethical sentences into what he considered to be their most fundamental meanings. One, this is wrong means, I disapprove of this, do so as well. Two, he ought to do this means, I disapprove of his leaving this undone, so also you should disapprove. And three, this is good means, I approve of this, do so as well. In other words, what these translations show is that a value statement's semantic meaning is shorthand for its emotive meaning. Without the concept of emotive meaning and without its imperative functions, Stevenson argued, it's impossible to explain why moral language works at all. The same seems to be true of his sense of statements about aesthetic value. Per his translations of moral propositions, the statement Lana Turner Has Collapsed is a good poem means, I approve of the poem Lana Turner Has Collapsed, and you should too. The only difference between moral and aesthetic value, Stevenson would say, is the object that the attitude responds to. So where did Stevenson find this concept of emotive meaning? No one will be surprised that he found it in The Meaning of Meaning by C.K. Ogden and I.A. Richards. This is a footnote from Stevenson's essay, The Emotive Meaning of Ethical Terms. On page 125, second edition, there's a passage on ethics, which was the source of the ideas in this paper. After all the subterfuge I've been dealing with Wimsatt, it is very nice to have someone just sort of say, yeah, this idea is not mine, here's where I found it. The passage that he refers to is the one where Richards and Ogden's discuss the meaning or meanings of good. It seems probable, they wrote, that, quote, this word is essentially a collection of homonyms, such as the set of things, roughly those in connection with which we heard it pronounced in the early years. A good bed, a good kick, a good baby, a good God have no common characteristic. But another use of the word is often asserted, where good is alleged to stand for a unique, unanalyzable concept. This concept, it is said, is the subject matter of ethics. This peculiar ethical use of good is, we suggest, a purely emotive use. For the purposes of understanding the place of moral value in the affective fallacy, this moment from the meaning of meaning is crucial. First, because it does show how indebted Stevenson was to Richards' concept of emotive meaning. Second, because of how it triangulates Richards' work, and therefore that of Stevenson and eventually Wimsatt and Beardsley, with respect to G.E. Moore's claim that good is metaphysically indefinable, although Richards plays fast and loose with this idea. If Moore found good to be indefinable or unanalyzable, we infer from Richards and therefore Stevenson it's because he was looking for a semantic meaning when he should have been looking for an emotive one. So if Richards constitutes a rejection of Moore's metaphysical morality, and if Stevenson turns Richards' emotivism into the basis for moral language, we start to see what's at stake in Wimsatt and Beardsley's exclusion of Stevenson's arguments. For Wimsatt and Beardsley, the affective fallacy wasn't just a way of preventing certain affective or aesthetic experiences. Instead, inasmuch as they rejected the derivation of any kind of value from emotion, and inasmuch as they also excluded Stevenson's moral arguments from their discussion, the affective fallacy was fundamentally a means of preventing a certain kind of moral experience. It was an attempt to stop readers from grounding any sort of value, whether critical, aesthetic, or moral, in emotion or feeling. But why do this? Why bother? Let's return yet again to Wimsatt's demand for a, quote, formula that recognizes the metaphoric capacities of language and the moral importance of valid linguistic expression without surrendering our conception of truth as a thing beyond language. Ironically, the issue for me here isn't this use of the word moral, but rather, again, the phrase conception of truth as a thing beyond language. What gives valid linguistic expression its moral importance is not the reading or writing of that expression here, but rather some kind of capital T truth that is outside and a priori to representation. And in the verbal icon, that capital T truth comes from two intertwined sources: Wimsatt's sense of Kant's rationalist morality and the larger Christian belief system that Wimsatt put his Kantianism in service to. For Wimsatt, rejecting the derivation of moral and aesthetic value from emotions was essential because it preserved what he considered to be the proper relations between morals and aesthetics, something he exemplified through his idea of the, quote, objective critic. These are points that we can reconstruct from the other essays in the verbal icon. In Poetry and Morals, Wimsatt articulated a top-down picture of moral value's supervenient relation to poetic value, where poetic value is distinct from moral value, but nonetheless entailed by it. Poetic value, he writes, though different from moral value, cannot be thereby considered as something autonomously remote from the rest of human experience. He continues, the greatest poetry will be morally right, even though perhaps obscurely so. All this is but the consistent capstone which completes but does not contradict a system of values in which poetic is distinguished from moral, and both are understood in relation to the master ideas of evil as negation or not being, a gap in order. In effect, Wimsatt presents the greatest poetry as that which matches those moral values that emerge during reading, but only insofar as any poetic and moral value follow from a larger set of a priori moral and metaethical assumptions. And the role of Wimsatt's objective critic is to lead others to these same a priori moral and metaethical assumptions. As the poem fixes emotion, which is the phrase that Wimsatt and Beardsley use in the affective fallacy to talk about the relation between poetic language and feeling, as the poem fixes emotion, the critic replaces any such emotive phenomena with phenomena of a different sort. The function of the objective critic, Wimsatt continued in Poetry and Morals, is by approximate descriptions of poems or multiple restatements of their meaning to aid other readers to come to an intuitive and full realization of poems themselves, and hence to know good poems and distinguish them from bad ones. In effect, what the objective critic does is push readers to reach a, quote, intuitive and full realization of poetic value, which, as we saw, Wimsatt understands as the necessary corollary to, if not byproduct of, moral value. And that is essentially the trick here. As Stevenson suggests that moral language hides the imperative nature of moral concepts, as well as the metaethical assumptions made therein, Wimsatt's objective critic must present morally instrumentalized interpretations of poems that nonetheless feel intuitively true. In that way, they proselytize a set of values that they can label as both intuitive and yet also inextricable from the textual object itself. This is the contradictory heart of the affective fallacy. Wimsatt and Beardsley ask us to disregard our affective responses to texts, not so we can get closer to the text, but so that a particular set of moral relations can be experienced as if they were already present, even though these beliefs originated elsewhere. The only way for poetic value to follow from moral value here, and the only way to make sure that these values seem objective and prior to the act of reading, is to prevent any other conception of moral or aesthetic good from taking root, i.e., from affect. Put another way, in order to, quote, recognize, I'm so tired of this quotation, to recognize the metaphoric capacities of language and the moral importance of valid linguistic expression without surrendering our conception of truth as a thing beyond language. What Wimsatt must do is convince us that our moral and aesthetic responses are emotional backwash projected outwards, while his moral and aesthetic truths have been hiding in the text, unseen and unfelt, until the right-thinking, self-described objective critic reveals them to us. Thank you.